can watch it later. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our What is Project-Based Learning webinar today. Our presenter is Becky Givany, one of our curriculum specialists at the IU. She'll say more about herself in a little bit. The session will be recorded today, so you can watch it on YouTube. It'll be in the form of a question or a presentation with a question and answer following it. So feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, and we'll open up the mics at the end for other questions that you might have. So Becky, take it away.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for having me today. And we're going to talk about, we're going to start our journey this week with project-based learning, and then tomorrow, how to build those digital portfolios. And then Thursday, get into making it into a capstone experience. So today, we just want to get a basic understanding of what is project-based learning. And my intentions for this session is to understand the difference between project-based learning and projects. And when I started my journey trying to understand the difference, or even just trying to implement project-based learning, I thought that just by doing projects, I was doing project-based learning. And so for me, that was my biggest aha when I sat actually in Brooke Biter's presentation about project-based learning. And since that presentation, I have really shifted my mindset with this kind of learning. We're also going to talk about the gold standard, which has just changed a couple of years ago, their model, and then how do you even get started? So the big debate is project-based learning or project. And when we talk about what is a project, I'm going to start with that right side of the screen. Well, it might be your left, but the project side. A project is something that is supplemental to a unit. And you want to remember, like, you might be doing curriculum and teaching, and then here's a project to summarize, sort of like a summative assessment. It's a task that has the students following directions, and you can repeat this year after year. So it's pretty much the same thing for your students, and you can use each year. It's typically done individually, and they mention, it's often at home. When I was in the classroom, I often gave time in the classroom to do projects too, just because, sometimes when students take things home, they either forget it at home or maybe they just do not have time. It is focused on the product. And again, like they say here, it is a project. The main idea is you want to have a final product. It's not necessarily the process of the learning that's taking place. And I beg to differ a little bit. I think that projects can be authentic to the real world and to the students' lives, but it's not rooted as deep, in my opinion, as a project-based learning experience could be. So if we go to the flip side then, for project-based learning, the students are really uncovering their learning throughout the project-based learning cycle. So it's not like I'm going to teach, here's a project. It's here's a problem, and let's work through it through a project-based lens, and then they gather the information. So a really good example of this is like the Genius Hour projects, where kids are discovering on their own. The project itself is a unit, and it's that major vehicle that's pushing the standards and the learning objectives forward. It's often open-ended, and so in that case, it cannot be repeated. The idea can be repeated year after year, but the final product will change based on how the student drives the process. Usually it is done in collaboration with a team. Now, right now, as we know, we are in a virtual digital age. And so most people are home. They cannot necessarily get together with people in a group and talk. However, virtually, they could be doing some virtual meetings, some hangouts, some small group discussions through Zoom or whatever platform you're using. This is usually done, project-based learning, with teacher guidance, and it's mostly during the school, like class time. The teacher is becoming the facilitator, in other words. There is sustained inquiry, so it's not something that it's just we're focused on getting this product done and then we're done. It's that inquiry that the kids want to keep coming back to throughout the whole semester, project, however long you carry out your project-based learning. And it's very authentic to the real world. You'll see in the golden standard, you eventually will make it a public product. So Couple of different examples. Is this project or project-based learning? And sort of, you can type it in the chat, but launching a recycling program that solves an identified problem with existing recycling programs. Actually, you can just give me a thumbs up if you want. Thumbs up if it is project-based learning. Thumbs down if it's project-based learning. Okay, so it actually is project-based learning because you are incorporating something and the kids are discovering on their own and monitoring and tying it to real-world problems and solutions. Next one, there's only 3 of them. Planning a garden that meets specific design objectives, then plant and tend to the garden throughout the seasons. Thumbs up if it's project-based learning. Thumbs down if it's project-based learning. If it's not project-based learning, that's what I meant. Good, this one is project-based learning, very good. And the last one, using key terms from the unit and completing a raft writing assignment. It's if you're not familiar with a raft writing assignment, role, audience, format, and topic. It's a different kind of writing assignment that teachers use. Okay, thumbs up if it's project-based learning. Thumbs down if it's not project-based learning. Good, it is not project-based learning. This would be an example of a project. Wonderful. So when we look here at the gold standard for project-based learning, we talk about the teaching practices. And so the essential focus is always on the key knowledge, understanding, and success and skills. That is what is basically your foundation and where you start when you're planning this. Obviously, as a teacher, you need to plan this out in your head first before you roll it out with students and start building that culture. So when you get to the first thing you want to think about is that design and plan phase. So you're planning from implementation. You want to have the whole plan from implementation to the launch to then the culmination. This can last as long as you want. It could be just a unit that you're doing project-based learning, or it could be a whole year that maybe on, like some people do the Genius Hour every Friday, you know, the exploration. You should be incorporating in this design and plan phase some student voice and choice. So students could help you with making the schedules. If you're using Google, you could set like a Google Calendar. And so that's what I'm talking about virtually. Like if you were in the classroom, you could do some calendars as well. You're teaching them through this design and plan phase some time management, some goal setting, and you'll notice like the students become empowered. They're becoming empowered learners. Then you want to make sure that this project-based learning experience for them is rooted and grounded with your standards. So you want to make sure you're addressing the key skills and standards that need to be addressed. I recommend, you know, always turning them in for your students to the I can statements. Telling your kids, you should be able to do this, and not just stating this. Sometimes people get like nervous and scared when they hear all the standards and everything, and it's just too much for them, especially, you know, students and parents. Just keep it basic, take it from what those teacher standards are, simplify it for parents and students, and just be like, I can, in Spanish, it was like, I can say a sentence in Spanish. That's a simple, you know, they can prove that. Ask yourself when you're at this stage, what skills do I or should my students have when they're done with this experience? Building the culture. You want to promote and acquire all of these things with your students. And independence can be hard as a student sometimes, but throughout this process, you want to think about how can I build some independence, for student independence, student growth, open-ended inquiry, meaning there's not just going to be an answer right there, right? They have to go search. They have to go seek out, use resources. There should be some team spirit in there and the attention to quality. So they might be able to articulate everything in a huge long paper, but really you want good quality, right? So what's the best thing for that? And how do you do that culture building? You find things that are engaging for them, that are authentic. And then throughout the process, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, you support them through checkpoints. Manage activities, okay? Throughout the process, then you want to think about all of these things you want to think about before you implement this. You know, teacher, you're going to work with the student to organize a schedule, and this could look different for each, if you're doing a group project-based learning experience, or each student. And you do this through conferencing, right? Set some personal checkpoints and deadlines, set those for students, and then help them as they're going through the process, fine tune the project. You might need to help them narrow a topic down. And then encourage reflection with them. Why do you think this is working? Why isn't it working? What could you do differently? Embed some of those lifelong skills that they're going to need to be lifelong learners. Scaffold student learning. So continue to use the pedagogy that you have in your toolbox already to reach all learners. There's a really great way, project-based learning is a great opportunity to differentiate your instruction to meet all learners. And think about how could you differentiate the project? Maybe it's not having them do as big of a project as others. Maybe it's diving deeper in Webb's depth of knowledge, or Bloom's, certain things like that. And then obviously you want to assess student learning. Keeping in mind the student voice as well. They can help create. A big part of project-based learning is having students help you create rubrics as well. But formative and summative assessment of your main focus. Remember, our main focus is that key knowledge, understanding, and success skills. So you want to embed some formative and summative assessment, and I'll give you some examples of that. And then use your checkpoints to assess them formatively. Those I can statements. If they can prove to you that they can do it, great, check, you did it. Also remember that peer and self-assessment to improve that teamwork and team spirit, work and atmosphere and environment. So this is an example here of the formative assessments that you could tie to learning outcomes. So you could see here's your learning outcomes and targets. This would be like an example of a spreadsheet that you could make, have your I can statements on the left, and then what checkpoints are you going to use? So when kids feel comfortable that they can do the I can statement, they would schedule a checkpoint with you, right? And then you could use any of those resources. And the last thing you become is a coach, really, the facilitator. You are learning alongside of your students. It might be something that you are not 100% comfortable with, but you are becoming also a learner alongside them. And I think that's really important to remember. And I think it's the hardest part for teachers when they take on this project-based learning atmosphere, is that you are no longer really the sage on the stage, and you have to give up some control of your classroom. And we have to be okay with that. You have to be able to help your students identify if they need redirection, if they need some encouragement, some celebration. Celebrate with them when they figure something out. And also, what skills do they need and how can they build on that? So, one second, I'm just checking time here real quick. So when you're designing your project-based learning, there's that whole framework right there, the practices. That's what you want to keep in mind as you're going through it and think it out. But on top of that here, we have some elements that when you're creating the project, you want to keep in mind. There should always be a challenging problem or question that is driving the project. And we talked about this before. We want sustained inquiry. There's a couple of changes that were made to these gold standard PBL elements and practices, and this is one of them. They want to make sure that students are having that open-ended inquiry throughout the whole project. It's not, oh, I solved this, it's done. How do we sustain that inquiry throughout the project? The authenticity. It needs to be authentic for the kids, for the buy-in, for the motivation, for the engagement piece. Having them partner with a business, a local business, is a great way for it to be authentic. If they see it, we'll get to the public product, but when they see their finished product public, that's huge. Another thing is very important is reflection. You're asking them, what have you learned? Where are you going? Whatever questions that you can really think of that will help drive and also see their growth as a learner. So what I have here is a PBL teacher rubric, and I'm going to show you here what it looks like. I'm hoping that you can see this screen. Can you see that? Okay. So that's not what I want to show you. This one. So this is linked in the presentation, and Scott and I'll put this on our online learning hub with the resources. Well, we'll put the presentation on, you can link. But here's a teaching rubric, and I'll make it a little bit bigger. If you're a beginning PBL teacher, if you're just starting this for the first time, you know, here are all the different practices and how you can start as a beginner, okay? Whereas if you have been doing this a while, here's a way that you can stretch yourself as well and try to continue to grow in this framework. So it has all of the different practices and how you can continue and do certain things. For example, with scaffolding the student learning, you know, front load your content. This can work as your own little checklist as you're trying to implement this. And then the last thing I want to show you is how you assess your students. And I put assess in quotations because it's not really necessarily assessment. It is, but I keep referring this to as a whole like experience. You're really immersing your students in an experience. It is not, the idea isn't I'm going to do this for a grade. The idea is I'm going to do this to become a lifelong learner. And so here are some. This is the 6 to 12 rubric. We have some other ones as well that are linked in here. But you can see it's not a traditional rubric, right? And I would have the students self-assess before you even look at it, and then have those conversations. I think the most important piece to remember in this whole process, especially now more than ever, is setting up those one-on-one conferences. I think you have more time now to do one-on-one conferencing than you would in a classroom. And I'm speaking from experience. When I tried to conference one-on-one and I had a class of 30 plus students, that's hard to keep the other 29 focused. Right now, they can schedule times with you to conference. So you would just sort of mark where they fall and how they can improve. And then you can assign a letter grade if you want, or you don't have to. But this is a great way of, right now, as we're heading into May, and the motivation isn't necessarily where it has always been. This might be a better way to motivate your students at this point in time. Also, depending on grading practices with what your district is planning to do at the moment, this is a great way for like a pass-fail if you're choosing that option, and to also collaborate. You can have, if a family is at home and kids, you know, they could work together. It doesn't matter if they're in 12th grade or 4th grade. The question can still be the same, and they can walk through the process together, but their expectations could be different. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, I believe. And I'm going to open up to any questions you might have regarding this. This was just a run through of the basics of project-based learning. And as always, I'm here to help if you have any questions or anything regarding putting this into practice.